Hello, I'm Robert Royal, and these are the TCT podcasts, the Catholic Thing podcast. We've got something a little bit different for you today. We're recording on December 29th, 2023, and I have with me this time a group. Usually we've been doing personal conversations, but we've got a group conversation for you today on several important end-of-the-year topics. We've got with us our old friend, Father Gerald Murray, who's familiar to most of you who follow this podcast. And Father Murray is, of course, a canon lawyer and a priest of the Archdiocese of New York. He's a pastor of a parish in New York. But we're also fortunate to have with us today Diane Montagna, who's a very prominent American, but a journalist living in Rome at this point. And I'm sure you'll be very happy to hear from her because she brings some very pointed comments to the various issues that she addresses. We also have with us Edward Pentin, who is a regular writer for the National Catholic Register and is also resident in Rome. So welcome to you all. Merry Christmas. We're in the afterglow of Christmas, and I wish we could say we're all happy about what we see when we are looking back into 2023 and forward to 2024. But I'm looking forward to what you all have to say, and I'm sure that our listeners and our viewers are eager to hear that as well. So let's start with this, because right before Christmas, the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith issued a document called Fiducia Supplicans, which purports to be an explanation of a so-called development and how blessings can be given. Now, normally blessings wouldn't be a controversial topic, but this particular document went out of its way, and it doesn't seem evident why it had to go out and do this, but it went out of its way to say that people in so-called irregular relationships, irregular unions, in other words, people who are divorced and remarried, people who are cohabiting, but even people who are in same-sex relationships can receive a non-liturgical blessing. And we'll get into some of the questions that, of course, that so-called development of blessings involves. But before we do that, I'd really like to talk with you all a bit about the reaction, because it's been an unusual reaction in that bishops, whole dioceses, it may be whole continents like Africa, have announced that they are not going to follow the disciplines that were specified in that document. And the priests have some discretion to decide who can receive a blessing. But it's a complicated situation. Diane, let me ask you first. Could you tell us a bit about what the reaction has been around the world? Because it's really quite astonishing.
It is, Bob. Yes. So right after the document was released, a backlash of responses started flowing in from individual bishops as well as entire bishops' conferences around the world. So, for instance, you had certainly from Africa, you had the Bishops' Conference of Zambia, Malawi, Nigeria, Togo. Cameroon was particularly strong. You had the Archbishop of Astana. He's the Archbishop of Astana, Kazakhstan. Bishop Athanasius Schneider, who some of the viewers will know, is his auxiliary bishop. They responded straight away. Poland followed. You had the head of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church respond on behalf of the entire Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, as well as a whole host. Most notably yesterday, the Hungarian Bishops' Conference responded, and you had people like Archbishop Chaput, who I think during this pontificate has remained relatively quiet and uncritical. He responded of his own accord, as did many other bishops, as well as confraternities, whether it's the British confraternity, the U.S. confraternity, or others of confraternities of priests, saying that this would cause too much scandal among the faithful, and so they don't really see a way to implement this document, and so they won't be.
Yeah, I'm hearing from parish priests that they've never seen this kind of reaction among their parishioners, that people in relatively large numbers are actually calling their pastors, and they're very, very perturbed about what this all portends. Father or Edward, would you like to comment on this?
I'll just jump in, Bob. Yes, exactly. This, what Diane cites and what you're referring to is a happy result of this disaster, because the document itself is worthless as a magisterial document. I say that not to create a stir, but simply to identify what it has no value, because it denies what the church has always taught. And it denies it while claiming at the same time not to accomplish what it intends to do. Cardinal Fernandez gave an interview to the Pillar in which he said, blessing a couple is not blessing a union. That is simply not true. Once you describe people as a couple, they are in a form of union. The church, in its previous document about homosexuality, refers to homosexual unions. They never call them couples. There's a word game going on. They want people to accept the homosexual lifestyle as being worthy of a blessing, but then they pretend we're not blessing the ceremony where it came about, or the enduring union, just a relationship, meaningless. So that's why I say it's worthless. This document essentially is recognized throughout the world as being not a true expression of the faith of the church, but an attack on the faith of the church.
Yeah, then that, despite disclaimers even within the document, there seems to be a kind of an internal self-contradiction. Edward, what reactions are you noticing?
Well, very similar. But what I've noticed, which I think is interesting, is how surprised people seem to be, surprisingly, that this document came out. Because I don't know if you remember, back in the Synod on the Family, we were all saying that this sort of thing was going to happen, even when the interim report came out in the middle of the Synod on the Family in 2014. People this subject came up then, and I think there was already predictions that this was going to happen. And then, of course, you had the Amoris Laetitia came out, which is the post-synodal apostolic exhortation on that synod, and that too obviously laid the groundwork for this. And so I think the common thread, which I think is being revealed through all of this, and a lot of the discord that we've had for the past 10 years, is Cardinal Fernandez, because he was the ghostwriter for a lot of these documents. I think the Evangelii Gaudium, for example, then moving on to Amoris Laetitia, and now this. And there is this common thread of as I say, discord, and this whole issue really has been sort of always in the background of all of these problems that we've had, whether it's communion for divorced and remarried or other aspects. So I think that's quite interesting, that this is all sort of being quite revelatory again about a certain aspect of this pontificate.
Yeah. Look, this raises a question in my mind, and I'm sure in other people's minds too. What does this say about synodality? Because one of the things that synodality, which no one seems to be able to define exactly, but one of the aspirations of synodality is to listen to everyone, to give everyone a voice. And we see that there's this varied reaction. We have priests that are pro these blessings. We have priests that are against it. We have bishops' conferences in Poland who reject it. There seem to be those in Germany who like it very much, although maybe not thinking that it goes far enough. But this clearly has an impact on even the process of synodality that we've been involved in over the past year. Father Murray, how do you think about that in terms of synodality?
Well, synodality really was the word of the year. And again, there's no definition found in any dictionary that I know. And even the first synod on synodality never came up with a real definition. There's something in the final concluding document attempts to summarize it, but it's still very vague. It's one thing to hear, it's another thing to listen, and then it's a third thing to agree with. So I think the ambiguity of the word synodality is meant to convey the leadership of the church, the Pope and his associates, have a way of seeing the things. They want everyone else to spend a lot of time listening to them, eventually to come to an agreement with what the leadership is saying. But it's obvious at the meeting of the Synod in October, there was no interest in promoting the homosexual lifestyle or its acceptance in the church among the assembled body. There were individual elements, particularly from Northern Europe, pushing it. So what happens? The Holy See then decides, well, we're going to short circuit the whole thing. They remove any reference to LGBT from the final concluding report, and then we get this document sprung on us. So this confirms my, how can I say, my suspicions of the pontificate, which is that when there's a call for people to tell us what we think, they only want to hear the answer that they're searching for. And I think that's what this reveals.
Diane, you made a very pointed comment during the synod on synodality that some of us.
Which one, Bob?
Well, I mean, I point to one of them. I mean, you're famous for actually probing these neuralgic points, but I in particular, I remember when you said, because people were saying, "Oh, the Holy Spirit is going to lead us to various conclusions," and you said, "How are we going to know whether it's the Holy Spirit or some other spirit that's making the decision?" What's your take on how this controversy, this mixed reaction, reflects back on synodality over the past year?
Well, I expect that many people are going to see synodality, the entire process, all of the money that went into this process. I think they'll see synodality as a bit, I hate to say it, but as a bit of a farce and as a cover word for dictatorship. That is, they weren't able to get LGBT through the final document or through the final document for this portion of the synod. So, those in leadership could see that there was enough opposition, even with what many considered a rigged synod this year. They still had enough. There was still enough opposition in order to get LGBT removed from the document. And just a few short weeks after that synodal body expressed, its common thinking. This document is imposed on all of the world's bishops, and if someone correct me, but I believe that Cardinal Muller pointed out, former prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, that this document did not even go through the proper process within the congregation. So I think on many levels, a lack of listening and lack of the normal process played out.
Edward, I noticed today in the news feeds that I consult here in the United States that in a Spanish interview, Cardinal Fernandez, who's the point man on this document, and apparently he's going to be going to Germany to talk with them about the restrictions, we hope, that the document places on bishops like the German bishops who have been preparing formal liturgical blessings for same-sex couples. But I saw in this Spanish interview that Cardinal Fernandez said even prior to his appointment in September as the head of the dicastery, that they were working on this document, which means that they were working on it during the actual synod on synodality. And some people, Father Raymond de Souza, for example, have raised the question, did you share with the people participating in the synod that this document was in process? And I know you followed this very carefully. Do you have any thoughts about, I mean, if this process was irregular within the dicastery, it's even stranger that it was going to trump whatever came out of the synod itself.
Well, again, Bob, I mean, we've seen this before. I mean, going back again to the midterm report of the First Family Synod, if you remember, they brought out the issue of homosexuality, which wasn't even discussed at that synod, and then gave it to the media. And so, of course, it made the impression in the media before anyone else. Then, of course, you had the synodality issue was imposed on the youth synod when none of the youth people knew what synodality was, and suddenly it was in their final document. And so each time you've had this deception and imposition of different things, using this synodality, as Diane said, as this kind of mask or cover for what they really want to push through. And so all this is never really any surprise. And the fact that Cardinal Fernandez was working on this before the synod shows you that it's just everything is normal, really. I mean, this is what they've done so many times in the past. So, but yeah, I think it just shows that this pontificate, sadly, is one very much, it seems, of a deceit, and as many people have said lately, sophistry. You've got it in the documents, you've got it in the way they act, and you're just seeing it all playing out perhaps more clearly than it was before, but certainly it's the same sort of modus operandi that we've seen for the past 10 years.
And Bob, let me jump in on this because I'm reminded, Ed brings up the history of that first synod on the family. But even before that, you may remember, shortly after the Pope was elected, he met with a group of religious from Argentina. And in the conversation, he said, well, when you get called to the CDF, go to the meeting, the Doctrine of the Faith, listen to what they have to say, smile, then go home and do what you want. That's what's exactly happening now. The African bishops have smiled and said, no, we're going to do what we want. So in other words, the medicine that was used to resist in the past, the decrees of the Congregation of Doctrine of the Faith is now being employed in the positive sense, in my opinion, about a document that contradicts what the Doctrine of the Faith has been saying for all this time.
Yeah, a lot of contradictions out there. Look, I know we're going to come back to this subject in this podcast and also in articles at the Catholic Thing in 2024, but let me turn to another set of subjects right now. I read in the news this morning that Cardinal Burke met with the Pope. He apparently came out and more or less said no comment to the press. Lots of people have observed that Cardinal Burke, as I'm sure many of our listeners and viewers know, it's said that he's going to be thrown out of his apartment, which is a Vatican apartment, it's kind of subsidized in Rome, and his stipend is going to be removed. At the same time, Cardinal Becciu has just been convicted by a Vatican court of having mishandled funds, and he's been sentenced to, 5.5 years, something like that, in prison. We don't know what that is actually going to mean, but he remains in his apartment. The rather strange case of Father Rupnik, who was a serial sexual abuser, he is still a priest in good standing. He was incarcerated in former Yugoslavia, in I think his home diocese. Diane, you're a follower of these things in Rome. What are we to make on this other dimension of incoherence that we seem to be seeing in the Vatican? Is it just incompetence? Is it just chaos? Or is there an underlying rationale to this?
Well, I think many observers would say that, well, you often hear the quote these days, for my friends, everything, for my enemies, not even justice. Whether that's the case, we don't know the Pope's heart.
It's an old Peronist saying from
Yes,
Argentina.
I know.
Juan
But it's being
Perón. I just want to make that clear. Right.
Yes, but it's being used quite often around here. I would like to make a couple of clarifications, if I could, about the case of Cardinal Burke. Just because there were many reports going around on what was taken away from him and what wasn't, the deal with the apartment. Regarding his stipend, the Piatto Cardinalizio, it's called, a certain stipend given to cardinals in order for them to take care of the things of their life as a cardinal. Because Cardinal Burke no longer had an office that he held, in which case it would have been considered like a salary in worldly terms. But because he no longer had an office, was at the age of retirement, I mean, what the Pope sadly did was he took away Cardinal Burke's only retirement benefit. And Cardinal Burke, people won't know this, but Cardinal Burke does not have another source of a pension or anything from, an archdiocese or another ecclesiastical institution. His health care was also taken away. Now, the monthly cost of that probably here at the Vatican is not much, but for a man who's in his mid-70s, people will remember, and many of the viewers probably prayed for Cardinal Burke when he was on a ventilator for 9 days during COVID, and probably by the intercession of Our Lady, I think that's what he would say, survived COVID, to take away his health care, to take away his pension. And then with the apartment, it's not that the Pope was decided to take away his apartment, but that he was going to charge him in maybe it was 4 times. I think Edward could comment on this. I believe he tweeted something out, 4 times the amount that he was currently paying, but of course without receiving his retirement benefit, so with nothing to live on. So I do think it's important to clarify those things. But I think this is a continuation of old cases that I know Father Murray has talked about, whether it's Zanchetta, the case where the Pope, created a position for him in APSA, who takes care of the Vatican properties. And Rupnik, I mean, Ed can speak to this, but Edward had an article earlier this week in which he pointed out that Rupnik he's incarnated in this new diocese, but he's living here in Rome at the Centro Aletti. So it seems that he's carrying on his normal life here in Rome. So it's more of the same, really.
Yeah, Edward, you want to get in on this? Clarify some of these points for us.
Yes. Well, no, Diane's exactly right. That is the issue with Cardinal Burke. And what I also found was quite shocking too, or certainly interesting, is that he wasn't given any formal notification about, that he's going to have his apartment raised so that he can't afford it and going to have his salary withdrawn. None of that was told to him by the Pope himself. It just came via unofficial channels. And the first he knew of it, he wasn't receiving his stipend, and he got a notification that his rent was being over quadrupled, so that he couldn't afford it. Now, I did actually ask an Italian lawyer about this, and I said, in civil law, in Italian law, would this ever be allowed, or how would you see this? And he said, absolutely not. You'd never get an employer or a state imposing this on somebody, because it would be criminal. It would be totally against the law. So there's no way that they could do this in civil law. So that's that issue. Referring to Father Rupnik, yes, I did make inquiries about where he was living, and I got confirmation that he wasn't living in Slovenia, but he is living at his Aletti Center in Rome and just carrying on as normal. There's been no real sanction, as far as I can see, about him. And of course, that's why he had to leave the Jesuits, was because he wasn't obeying their restrictions. And now he's free from the Jesuits. He's just carrying on without seemingly any authority over him to say, you've got to stop doing what we told you to stop doing. And so he's just carrying on as normal. I think he's under, he's clearly incardinated in Slovenia, but because he's not in Slovenia, he's not having any real oversight over here. So he's just carrying on as normal, and Cardinal Burke and others who try to uphold the Church's teaching are being punished. But that's an old story that we know quite well now.
Mm-hmm. Father Murray, you're a canon lawyer, so what do you make of this Rupnik case? I mean, I know you and I have talked about this privately, but it's very puzzling, really, isn't it? I mean, he seems to be as guilty as a person could possibly be, even of blasphemous kind of sexual liturgical acts that he was going to commit. And yet I thought that he was going to be brought under some kind of canonical process or legal process. Can you enlighten us a bit about that?
Sure. No, the canonical history here is both lengthy, complicated, and horrifying. He was convicted by the Congregation of Doctrine of the Faith of having violated the canon which prohibits pardoning a partner in a sexual sin, which is an automatic excommunication. That was lifted and within a few weeks. But at the time, there was no notification that he had been excommunicated or that the penalty had been lifted. That came out in a leak, which was reported in the secular media. When that followed, then we learned also that the Jesuits had done an investigation and recommended to the Congregation of Doctrine of Faith asked the Jesuits to do a study on these further charges of sexual abuse involving people under his spiritual care, nuns and novices, and that the Jesuits recommended he be prosecuted. And then it was announced we can't prosecute because of statute of limitations, even though the statute of limitations is regularly lifted during the sex abuse crisis for similar crimes. The Pope himself claimed at one point, I had nothing to do with this process except for one small procedural rule that I changed. Even though you have to say, when it comes to lifting an excommunication of a priest imposed by the CDF for that crime of pardoning a partner in a sexual sin, that can only be done by the Pope or the CDF at his discretion. So then the Pope announced after the incarnation controversy, because Yes, he is essentially a priest in good standing of a Slovenian diocese, working with permission of his bishop in Rome, and with the that implies that the Roman authorities have not told him to leave Rome. So he's being treated as if he did nothing. Once a priest is under investigation for serious crimes, they should announce precautionary measures, such as he cannot celebrate the sacraments in public, he cannot engage in spiritual guidance of people, he should not dress as a cleric, he should be restricted into a living situation where he's under some surveillance. None of that's been announced. In fact, we don't know which tribunal is handling this. Is it the tribunal of Rome? Is it the Diocese of Rome? Is it the CDF? What's going on? Well, long and short of it is, as in so many canonical proceedings during the pontificate, things are announced publicly and then there's no follow through. It's like the Vox Estis investigations of bishops. The law is there to investigate bishops. We never know which bishops are under investigation, and we never know what the outcomes are until the bishops themselves often reveal it. So, without getting into too much detail, there are more questions than answers here.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll be back with this one again in 2024 as well. Let's roll the camera back and take a little bit wider perspective. The Holy Father said some very interesting things in his Urbi et Orbi address for 2023. He denounced many situations of war around the world and oppression. He spoke about Ukraine. He spoke about Palestine and Israel. He spoke about Africa. One of the things many people are concerned about is he doesn't seem to speak enough. He does mention it occasionally, but enough about persecution of Christians. And we know that in recently there has been even further persecution in Nicaragua, which is a country that he doesn't seem to want to touch. Jimmy Lai, the Catholic businessman and journalist and liberty fighter in China, is now undergoing a juridical process. What are we to make of this? There seems to be, the concern for the things that we're all concerned about, but the specifically Catholic and Christian persecutions or Christian problems around the world don't seem to be getting a lot of attention. Diane, is that your perception of where we are right now?
Yeah, certainly. Though you've had some news stories, although the point of these news stories often is why is the persecution of Christians not getting more coverage? For instance, just today, Inez San Martin, she's from Argentina. She was part of the Vatican press corps. Today, she said that yet another priest, and in fact, she says the third priest in the past 36 hours has been kidnapped in Nicaragua. You also have the horrific case of the Christmas slaughter in Nigeria. I believe the death count is over 150. It may be well over that, of Christians just slaughtered in their village on Christmas. So yes, it is at least the glaring absence of coverage by the world's media to these stories is getting some attention among Catholics.
Mm-hmm. Edward, do you want to add to that at all? I know you follow these issues very carefully.
Yes. It's hard to tell why he doesn't. I mean, he has spoken out occasionally. I remember when he was on the trip to Burma, he spoke about the Rohingya and so forth. So he does speak out when he wants to. But as you say, it is rare, and it's not clear why he doesn't. I mean, with the China situation, of course, and the Uyghurs, he doesn't want to upset the Chinese Communist Party because of the agreement they've made with Beijing. But then the other issues, I don't know. He just doesn't seem to. He did go to Iraq, of course. That was a big thing. But his actual public pronouncements are pretty sporadic and not consistent. And even though he does speak out occasionally, and always with Pope Francis, you can speculate about why he does and doesn't do things, but it's very difficult to know for sure. So I don't know why he's not speaking about the Nigeria persecution, for instance, or really singling out that, because there have been so many Christians who've been persecuted and martyred over there.
Yeah, something like 4,000 in 2023 have been martyred. Yeah. Well, we're getting near the end of our time, so I'm going to ask each of you an impossible question. two parts. 2024 is just a couple days away. So let me ask each of you, what do you think are going to be the major stories? What's going to be happening in 2024? And what should be happening? Because if you ask me, the church should be really turning up the heat under evangelizing. Around the world, we see the church's presence slipping away, and we need to turn up that evangelizing zeal that seems to have disappeared. Sometimes the Pope speaks of proselytizing. He doesn't want that, but it isn't always clear. He distinguishes between that and evangelizing. So let me begin, Father, with you. What do you think are going to be the major news stories in 2024, and what should they be?
Well, there are a bunch of them that I can think of, Bob. I'll try to go quick. The first is going to be the fallout from this homosexual blessing document, because the split that we talked about earlier is only going to be accentuated. The Holy See is going to have to speak and answer questions. Cardinal Fernandez is already doing that. In my opinion, this is going to be the major inheritance of this pontificate, the attempt to normalize homosexuality in the life of the church and the rejection of that attempt by large segments of the Catholic population. Second story is going to be papal health because, of course, just turned 87, in the wheelchair, walking with a cane, had the bad flu about a month ago, had to cancel a trip to Dubai. So his health is going to be a constant preoccupation. Of course, there's one thing the world media is looking forward to as a audience gathering. It's another conclave, because that's one of the few times when the world's media basically hones in on Rome and the Catholic Church. Third story, which we talked about already, is synodality. I think it's now going to be dead on arrival, because the split among the bishops in the world is going to say, what's the point of spending a month in Rome with facilitators and saying prayers to the Holy Spirit to guide us when the agenda that we are not interested in is being imposed? Think about the transgender godparents. When in the world did that ever arise as an issue for the world's bishops? But they got a document. So, and then I'll say a fourth thing is going to basically be what leaders in the church are going to emerge in the midst of all this controversy and the Pope's declining health as likely candidates to be elected Pope or to influence that selection process. So your point is great. We should be talking about the beauty of the gospel. There's one thing I realize. I live in New York City. Secularism makes people unhappy and depressed. So if we talk about the beauty of receiving the sacraments, honoring the Virgin Mary and doing what Catholics do, works of charity, that's going to bring happiness in the world. Unfortunately, we're submerged with these internal fights, but those fights need to be fought. I'll just say that.
Diane, you want to take a crack at those two questions?
Well, Father Murray covered things extremely well. I think I would probably add.
Yeah, I put you in an impossible situation.
It's
following
okay.
the good Father.
I'm very comfortable with that. I suppose what I would add, given on the subject of both the Pope's health and this document, I do think that, is it the case? We don't know if it's the case, but is it the case that, the Pope's health, he is 87 years old and he's not in good health, whatever the particular case of his health is. What is it the case that they've pushed this document through because they think that there's not much time left in this pontificate? Whatever the case might be, I do think that Fiducia supplicans is going to be a defining factor for the next conclave. And so the responses from the bishops, from the bishops' conferences right now, I think is going to send a strong signal and also be remembered among the cardinals in the next conclave. So I think that that's the big story to look for.
Good.
That is in terms of a future conclave.
Well, I think, Bob, just on a general view, I'm actually quite hopeful because I think we're going to see more revealing of what's going on in the church, and more revealing of the corruptions, whatever they are, whether it's doctrinal, sexual, financial, and just the general bankruptcy, if you like, of the current post-conciliar church. And I think what you're going to get is more revealing of that, which is actually hopeful, because I think from there things can really improve. It reminds me of something that Cardinal Pell used to say quite close to before he died. He said he was actually hopeful, and he said he was an optimist because things can only get worse. Because if things get worse, you can see things more clearly, and then reform things better. And so I think also if there were a conclave too this coming year, I think you're going to see quite a swing away from the Francis pontificate and this line of Francis moving much more towards a conservative line. But that obviously remains to be seen. But I think if there were a conclave perhaps later in the year, that might happen, because I think things will get worse. I think we will see more revealing, more splits, more division. But from that, I think you're going to see a sort of foothold really on how to really reform the church for the better in the pontificates coming after Francis.
Well, on
So,
that happy and hopeful
let me
note.
let me jump in here. What do you see? What do you see,
Yes,
Bob, as
Bob.
the
Yes.
2024 Catholic storyline?
Yeah, you're not allowed to ask that question. No, I agree with all you. I would even go farther. We've not even gotten into the question of, we've been told in another document that we need to have a theological paradigm shift, which sounds like an utterly radical reformulation of virtually everything. We're not supposed to do desk theology, that we're supposed to do, down to earth theology. But what is desk theology if not fiducia supplicans? I mean, it seems to be this hair splitting about whether you're blessing a couple or whether you're blessing a union, or there's so many contradictions here in a church that used to pride itself, as even many non-Catholics used to say, it was a church that knew what it believed in. And I think that I talked about evangelization, but I think that the turn that the church is going to have to make, and Francis has said this, but I don't think he's followed through on it so much, is not to be worldly. Because if anything, but blessing homosexual unions is a worldly and actually first worldly preoccupation. What are the countries in which that document has been accepted with some degree of praise? Well, it's Europe, it's Germany, it's France, it's Italy. Where are the places where it's been rejected? It's been in the very peripheries that the Holy Father has spoken about. And Father D'Souza will say tomorrow in the Catholic thing that Francis has talked about the theology of your abuela, of your grandmother, how important it is, and how many grandmothers are going to like the blessing of homosexuality. I think not very many, actually. So I agree with Edward that every radicalism tends to generate its corrective, and we can only hope and pray that in 2024 the things that we're worried about will have enough power that they will create a counter movement of the spirit, if I can say that to you, Diane, before we finish. Well, thank you, I think, Father, for asking.
Wonderful.
Well, look, we're at our end, and we finished on a kind of a hopeful, forward-looking note. So thank you, my guests. Thank all of you who are listening or watching, and we will see you again next time at the podcast of The Catholic Thing, which you can subscribe to for free at www.thecatholicthing.org.